Hello everyone, this is Dr. Sutherland. We are considering psychoanalytic theory today for our counseling systems and interventions class. We will be looking at the foundational assumptions for that theory, and then we will complete our case conceptualization involving Mrs. C, who is the identified patient in our text. So in terms of the primary assumptions for psychoanalytic theory and its look at pathology, key things that you need to know and be sure that you understand involve the dynamic forces motivating personality, which are eros and thanatos, and you need to be clear on the basis of neurosis, which in its simplest form is the conflict that is expressed between the id and the superego. That would be the id's instinctive, sexual, and aggressive desires, and society's retribution, which is internalized by the moral compass of the superego. And so anxiety and guilt arises as related to that conflict. Also, make sure you know and understand that the symptoms that are going to be evident in our clients are an indirect expression of that person's unacceptable wish, and that defense mechanisms are the vehicle through which the the ego is able to uh, uh, promote a compromise, if you will, between the id and the superego. And basically that means a compromise that allows for a more acceptable expression of the sexual and aggressive urges that are part of the id, such that they are more acceptable to society and that individuals can then function more appropriately within that vein. So please make sure that you do understand these 5 concepts. If you have questions, please do write them down, and you can bring them to class with you. In terms of vocabulary that you need to know, these are the key terms from our text on this and the next slide. You should be familiar with all of them in order to engage in cogent discussion surrounding psychoanalytic theory. However, those that I've highlighted in blue are the ones that I will hold you most accountable for in terms of exams. So please, at the very least, that you know and understand what the concepts in blue mean and how they are related to psychoanalytic theory, the development of personality, and therapeutic approaches surrounding intervention. So, psychoanalytic theory tells us that neurosis is the conflict between sexual and aggressive urges and societal norms. Defense mechanisms are the inner restraints that would control the awareness and expression of those sexual and aggressive urges, and without them, those urges would be uncontrollable. And so, personality then is developed within 3 primary psychosexual stages. There are 5. The oral, anal, phallic, latent, and genital stages. However, the first 3 stages, the oral, anal, and phallic stages, are the primary stages during which personality is developed and during which fixations can occur that will influence and lead to pathology in later life. So we're going to look at those stages and how psychoanalytic theory posits the development of personality within those stages. So again, neurosis is the conflict that exists between sexual and aggressive urges and societal norms. And the lack of resolution within that conflict is where pathology begins. So, in the oral stage, which is birth to 18 months, sexual and aggressive impulses take the form of sucking, things that occur with the mouth, including breastfeeding, bottle feeding, toys, sucking toys, fingers, babbling, things like that. Those are the expressions of the sexual and aggressive urges or impulses, and societal rules are aimed at controlling these impulses. How parents provide for the needs of children in this particular phase determines how impulses are controlled and determines the resulting personality. So there are three possible parental expressions. One is a balanced expression, of course. And then deprivation and overindulgence are the two primary parental approaches that can lead to fixation on either side of the bipolar personality spectrum. If you will recall in your text, there is a listing of the bipolar personality traits, and if you recall, they are expressed as opposite ends of a spectrum, or opposite sides of a coin, if you will. So, for example, in the oral stage, you have on the deprivation side of the parental approach, personality traits developing such as pessimism or suspiciousness or self-belittlement or passivity or envy. And then on the other side of the parental spectrum in terms of characteristics, overindulgence exists, which is the opposite of deprivation. And as such, within the overindulgence side, personality traits that can be developed in the child include optimism or gullibility or cockiness or manipulativeness or admiration, all of which are opposites of the other side of the coin. Pessimism versus optimism, suspiciousness versus gullibility, self-belittlement versus cockiness, passivity versus manipulativeness, envy versus admiration. So just remember that in every stage, that is how your bipolar personality traits look in terms of being opposite sides of the same coin. And so again, how parents provide for the needs of their children within those particular parental characteristics determines how these impulses are controlled and the resulting personality of their child. So, based on the conflict between these sexual and aggressive impulses and societal rules, and said a different way, based on the conflict between the id, sexual and aggressive impulses, and the superego's moral dictates, which are an internalization of society's rules that are controlling of the impulses, guilt and anxiety occurs because of that conflict. And the guilt and anxiety are over these impulses and a desire for immediate gratification. That is at the root of guilt and anxiety. So, your oral stage defense mechanisms, which is or are an internalization of the ego, which provides the compromise between these two warring factions, the id and the superego, sexual and aggressive impulses and society's rules. Your ego then presents defense mechanisms, and the goal of defense mechanisms in this stage and in all stages are to reduce guilt and anxiety that is caused by the conflict, such that the guilt and anxiety are manageable and one can operate successfully in the world. The oral stage defense mechanisms are denial, projection, and incorporation. Please be sure that you do know and understand the meanings of these defense mechanisms and how they are expressed. This is in your text, so please be sure that you understand that, those concepts. And so once again, just to be clear, guilt and anxiety are at the source of psychopathology. That guilt and anxiety is a result of the conflict between sexual and aggressive impulses and, which is the id, and societal rules aimed at controlling these impulses, which are internalized by your superego. So the conflict between the id and superego is rather mediated by your ego in the form of defense mechanisms such as denial, projection, and incorporation in this particular stage. And the goal of your defense mechanisms, the goal of the ego's compromise, is the reduction of guilt and anxiety such that it is manageable and individuals can function in society in healthy ways. So, if we take a look at Mrs. C from our text and talk about whether or not her fixation was in the oral stage, we must begin that conversation with an understanding of the basic premise of the theory, or a basic premise of the theory, that there is some event that has occurred in one of these pregenital stages that remains unresolved. And if that is the case, then there is a fixation in that stage. And so when there's a stressor, a life stressor, there is, in its simplest way to say it, a triggering of the link to that event, an association to that event from that particular pregenital stage. And so those stage-related impulses are triggered. The defense mechanisms developed in that stage are used, and pathology occurs or continues because those child defense mechanisms are no longer effective for managing symptomology that is occurring in adulthood. So if we understand that premise, that there is some event that occurred that remains unresolved, so there's a fixation there that is associated with the pathology that is observed in adulthood, then our question is, for Mrs. C's case, is the pathology that we see in her in the current time associated with a fixation that occurred in the oral stage? And that is the question that you're answering when you're making this type of assessment. So if we take a look then at parental characteristics, because remember, neurosis, the conflict between the id and the superego, is going to be influenced and decided or resolved based on how parents provide for the needs of the child within that particular stage. So if we look at mom and dad, would we say that they had a balanced parental characteristic or deprived or overindulgent parental characteristics? You know, if we take a look at them, there really doesn't seem to be any significant deprivation in terms of needs not being met, neglect occurring. I would say that for the most part their needs were met. There's nothing that tells us in any way about whether mom and dad were trustworthy or not trustworthy, so you know, one can assume that there was a balance there for them. Someone could argue that there might have been a little bit of deprivation. If we take a look at Mrs. C's personality, if we thought about the idea of self-belittlement as part of her personality, and self-belittlement is going to be characterized by a thought process such as, I'm so awful, no one cares about me. Maybe we could say that, but even if we could make a case for that, really and truly it's not a strong case, and there are no significant defense mechanisms from this stage that Mrs. C is utilizing in the present, or that we can see in her present functioning. We don't see denial or projection or incorporation. So it might make sense that for Mrs. C, there would seem to be no major fixation in this oral stage, meaning that Mrs. C probably made an adequate adjustment, even if not perfect, within that stage to anything that might have been off balance in terms of parental styles and personality trait development. So then that leads us to go ahead and move on. Taking a look at the anal stage, which is 18 months to 3 years, to see if we can answer the question, based on Mrs. C's presentation at the current time, can we make a link between her current presentation and a fixation that potentially occurred in the anal stage? All right, so your anal stage is 18 months to 3 years. And so we're looking again at the conflict between sexual and aggressive impulses contained in your id and societal rules aimed at controlling those impulses, which is internalized by your superego. Within this particular stage, sexual and aggressive impulses are in the form of power struggles. You'll note the difference from the oral stage, where sexual and aggressive impulses were in the form of lack of control over impulses and a desire for immediate gratification. In this stage, however, we're looking at power struggles, and so those struggles will be around when to go to the bathroom, when not to go to the bathroom, what to eat, when to sleep, how to dress, whom to kiss, and how parents manage these power struggles determines the resulting personality structure of the child. So, in this stage, we are considering whether the parental characteristics were balanced, or were they demanding, or were they overindulgent. Different from the oral stage, where we looked at balanced or depriving or overindulgent. So make sure you are clear on the differences between the stages. Either of the two latter approaches then leads to fixation on one side of the bipolar personality spectrum, which we talked about before. In this anal stage, your over demanding parent may yield personality traits such as stinginess or constrictedness or stubbornness, and your overindulgent parent may lead to personality traits such as wastefulness or explosiveness or acquiescence. Please see your text for clarity on what describes those particular bipolar personality traits. So, guilt and anxiety is what we are always looking at in terms of the source of pathology or the expression of pathology. And in this phase, guilt and anxiety is over the desire for power and control and a desire for immediate tension reduction. And so our anal stage defense mechanisms come into play, which is our ego, in order to promote a kind of compromise between your id, the sexual and aggressive impulses, and your superego, the societal rules aimed at controlling those impulses. Those defense mechanisms, and in this stage they are reaction formation, undoing, and intellectualization, are aimed at reducing guilt and anxiety to manageable levels so that one can function successfully in the world. So if we take a look at Mrs. C and try to answer the question, given her current pathology, can its roots be traced back to a fixation in the anal stage? We would begin by looking at parental characteristics. Were Mrs. C's parents balanced? Were they over-demanding? Were they over-indulgent? One would say probably over-demanding. Why would we say that? If we look at her mom, compulsive and overly concerned with cleanliness and disease is one of the things that we saw in Mrs. C's mother. We also saw her mother as painting sex as unclean. We also saw dad as over controlling, would not allow shows of anger or aggression from the children, and would also not allow an interest in boys. If you recall, there was discussion around him waiting up at night for her to come home from a date to talk about what she was doing and why she was out with boys, the whole 9 yards. So we can make a case that her parents were over demanding rather than overindulgent or balanced. So if we make a case that Mrs. C's parents were over demanding, um, it might make sense that her parents might be looking at anal stage functioning, where the fixation would have occurred, that her parents might have been harsh or demanding about stage-related sexual and aggressive impulses. And those impulses included things like when to go to the bathroom and when not. So what might that look like? It might look like being forced to hold it so that she's clean because mom was overly concerned with cleanliness, for example. Um, we could also maybe theorize that her parents would have been um, overly concerned about sexual issues, um, whom to kiss, and saying that kissing is dirty or sex is dirty. Why? Mom was very compulsive and painted sex as unclean. So it could be said that her parents were over-demanding and that the sexual and aggressive impulses regarding power struggles could have looked like that. If that were the case, we could theorize, based on Mrs. C's current functioning, that maybe the resulting personality structures from the anal stage fixation or development and fixation might have been stinginess or constrictedness or stubbornness. Those are all the personality traits on the over-demanding side of the spectrum. For parents who are over-demanding, those are the traits that may show up in a child in terms of personality. So, what could we make a case for? If we look at Mrs. C's current functioning, her excessive orderliness in, for example, alphabetizing rather, the ordering of her children's names, or her meticulousness about cleanliness, or stinginess in holding on to unused clothing while not buying new ones, or her constrictedness in never letting go of her sexual feelings or becoming excited, or never letting go of emotions such as anger, could support the idea that her personality structure developed in the anal stage around stinginess and constrictedness potentially is feeding a fixation developed in that stage. We could look then at related child stage defense mechanisms um, that we may see Mrs. C exhibit in adulthood. So, the defense mechanisms for this stage are reaction formation, undoing, and intellectualization. Uh, and it could be that all three of those were, in fact, defense mechanisms that she used. And we'll look at whether or not we can make the case for that. If so, it might make sense that Mrs. C developed stage-related defenses against anal pleasures, such as being dirty, and against expressions of anger, which points us again to stinginess and constrictedness. So, how do we pull all this together and make sense of it? Go back to your basic premise of the theory, or one of the basic premises of the theory. There is some event that occurred in some pregenital stage that unconsciously remains unresolved, or such that there is a fixation. So, when a current stressor triggers an unconscious primary process association to that event, I'll say that a different way. So, when there is a current stressor that triggers a linking to that event in that particular pregenital stage, Then stage-related basic impulses are also triggered because there is an unconscious primary association. I'll say it one more time for you. When there's a current stressor that can be linked to an event in one of the pregenital stages, that linking is called an unconscious primary process association. When that happens, stage-related basic impulses are also triggered. Then your adult client will defend using child-developed defense mechanisms. So your adult client will avoid giving in to the impulses of that stage because of fear. And in psychoanalytic speak, the fear is of rejection or castration. Um, the child-developed defense mechanisms that they then use because they want to avoid that are used in adulthood, and they're from the stage in which they're still fixated. But those defense mechanisms are no longer effective because they are child defense mechanisms. This is how psychopathology works within psychoanalytic theory. So let's look at Mrs. C even more closely. What are the current stressors? If we say that there is some event, some stressor that triggers the unconscious primary process association, what are Mrs. C's current stressors? Well, her daughter's pinworms. Then the family, there was a running of the Asian flu through the family. She had a toddler in diapers. She was pregnant. All of those things were occurring at the same time. Very stressful. So, Mrs. C probably had very strong emotions about all of these things occurring at the same time. I can imagine if it were me, I might be overwhelmed. I might feel like crying. I might feel like screaming. I might even feel angry. But as we know, Mom was prohibited from showing strong emotion as a child, and as such she developed a constricted personality structure. Thus, what she wants to do, which is the aggressive impulse, becomes constrained by her stage-related defense mechanism. In this case, it would be reaction formation. So behaving the opposite of what one truly desires. So for example, she might have wanted to cry, scream, yell, XYZ, but she was constricted from doing so, and so she behaved in the opposite way. That is reaction formation. Also, Mrs. C had to, by doctor's orders, examine her daughter's anus at night to confirm pinworms as part of her daughter's healing process or management process. Within the anal stage, there is an unconscious desire to take pleasure in the relationship with your bowel movements. That's childhood. And all that means is it feels good to let go. That's all that means. And everybody knows every toddler likes to go to the bathroom. It feels good to let go. So, this, however, was prohibited by her mother, who was compulsively clean. So we talked about the idea that the over-demanding mother, who was compulsively clean, might have said, "Hold it, don't go as often because you need to be clean," for example. So, in Mrs. C's illness and weakened state, being fixated in the anal stage where there is a desire to take pleasure in bowel movements, she probably wanted to or struggled with a desire or sexual pleasure that was induced in some way when she was required to examine her daughter's anus at night to confirm pinworms. So the conflict came between the desire to take sexual pleasure in that and knowing that she should not do that. So guilt and shame becomes constrained by her stage-related defense mechanism, and in this case, it is undoing. It is being sorry for unacceptable desires or behaviors. So, for example, um, it feels good to let go, and it feels good to um, think about or be associated with this part of the anal side of her desires, but she's ashamed because it's not supposed to feel good. It's supposed to be bad. And so her avoiding feces as well in connection with dirty underwear that she does not want to touch or wash also serves as a defense mechanism for her. And then finally, her compulsive washing becomes an added defense mechanism against feeling unclean. And this is probably we can see as an extension of reaction formation. I want to be dirty, but I must be clean type of thing. She really does desire to indulge in that sexual impulse, but she doesn't want to. She has to be clean, and so the compulsive washing becomes a defense mechanism as well. One thing to remember too is that there is a secondary gain in neurosis. And in Mrs. C's case, what that means is that your secondary gain, your neurosis works to satisfy some type of unconscious or unstated need, and that's the secondary gain. If we take a look at her repeated showering, that ritual that she has, she starts and then she forgets where she is and she has to start all over again. And so she's repeatedly washing the same places over and over again because she can't remember where she started. Well, according to this theory, it would theorize that she repeatedly would stimulate her anus when she re-washes that area. And so that is a secondary gain because it meets her unstated need, that sexual impulse that she is trying to avoid because it's wrong. But with the repeated showers that she's choosing to help herself get clean, she, in an inadvertent, unconscious way, satisfies the need for stimulation of her sexual impulse when she stimulates her anus. If we take a look at the messy house that the kids complain about, and making her husband get up at 5 o'clock in the morning every morning to help her wash and keep track of where she is, things like that. Think of it in terms of a form of aggression that mom is not allowed to overtly show. It is an unconscious need that she has, an unstated need that she has to express herself, but she cannot overtly do that. So her children and her husband didn't really do anything to her, but she feels how she feels. And so her forcing her husband to help her get up every morning at 5 o'clock and keep track of what she's doing and keeping the house messy even though the kids are complaining, and walking around the house naked even though the kids are embarrassed and complain about that, all of that can be considered passive aggressive behavior. She can't express any anger over the situation, and so she's unconsciously expressing that in her current household. She can't express anger towards her parents. She might be angry towards them, but they're not around anymore, so her husband and her children potentially will be at the receiving end of that. And that's how we would conceptualize Mrs. C in the anal stage, and we would say that this is probably where her fixation, it makes the most sense that this is where her fixation would lie. The phallic stage, which is 3 years through to 6 years old, this is not an area necessarily that we can make a connection for her in terms of being fixated in this stage. Fascination with genitalia, sexual desire for the opposite sex parent, aggressive feelings towards the same sex parent. That is not something what we see in her case. Then you have your latency stage and your genital stages. Personality development has occurred at this point by the time you reach the latency stage, and as you will see, what is here is what is going on in the 2 stages. So please be sure again to note any questions that you have and bring them to class next time, and we will review your questions and continue to clarify. In terms of the therapeutic process of change, refamiliarize yourself with that concept. You can take a look back at your notes from week 1 or 2 when we talked about that, and or you can access the video on the therapeutic process of change. The first thing that we consider is, what are we after? What are we trying to do or accomplish in terms of moving a person from dysfunction to health? In psychoanalytic theory, we are trying to make the unconscious conscious. We are trying to increase awareness that the client's behavior is driven by the sexual or aggressive impulses, characteristic of the stage within which there is an unresolved event to which the client is making an unconscious primary process. It will be important for you to be very familiar with this slide and the next that discusses the 6 things that we are as part of the healing process in psychoanalytic theory. The second thing that we look at in the therapeutic process of change, which is the process we will look at for every theory, the second thing we look at here is, how do we make the unconscious conscious? And we're looking at specific factors that will be influential in this therapeutic process of change, in this part of the process of change. And for psychoanalytic theory, here are the specific factors on how we would the unconscious conscious. The third thing that we look at in terms of the therapeutic process of change is what we are changing. So first, we looked at what we were after in terms of change, and in this case, making the unconscious conscious. Then we looked at how we were going to make the change, and the specific factor pieces there. And now we're looking at what we are changing, the second half of specific factors. Primary in this model is interpersonal conflict. This is our primary focus in psychoanalytic theory. For the most part, anxieties and defenses, not so much self-esteem, not so much responsibility as well. There's not really any freedom or choice in psychoanalysis. It's the idea that the unconscious drives everything. So, in some ways, by default, if you think about it philosophically, we can say that there is really no responsibility. But, that's a debate. That's not something we'll have here, but just understanding that that is the primary area, interpersonal conflicts, and primarily defenses. And be familiar with everything there from your text, as well as what we would potentially be looking at in terms of interpersonal conflicts, and in the case of Mrs. C, intimacy and sexuality with her husband, things like that. And then individual social conflicts, and then beyond conflict to fulfillment. Finally, the 3 interrelated components of the therapeutic relationship is something that you should be familiar with. For psychoanalytic theory, we are looking at the working alliance, transference, and countertransference as key components. Very familiar with that. Again, please note any questions you have now that you have heard the lecture, and then you have taken a look at this video to try to reinforce some of what we talked about in class. Please write down any remaining questions and send them to me, and then we will take a look at them in class. In fact, you can email them to me or put them in any form that I've asked you to put them. I may have already told you that in class, and then we'll discuss them. Alrighty? Talk to you later.